My co-authors on this are Brian Caldwell, who is my business partner, and Brian and I have worked together for well over 30 years in the spraying business. And you'll see pictures of him, and Jason DeVoe. Jason DeVoe is a provincial specialist in Ontario, and we share information. All right. Drift reduction really hasn't, the basic premises of drift reduction really haven't changed in a long time. We always talk about things like a well-educated operator, and we heard some of those comments earlier today from Andrea and from the other presenters. We always talk about nozzle choice, and it's primarily about droplet size, and the messaging is still that, coarser sprays are better. We do talk about equipment usage as well, and always have. We encourage users to go slower and to lower their booms, of course, as you might expect. Weather conditions we'll spend a little bit of time on. Wind speed is the big one. That's sort of the go, no-go decision. But remember in the discussions earlier today, we also talked about this phenomenon called inversions and our sort of we're inclined to go for calmer and calmer conditions, but in fact, that may be counterproductive, and we'll explain why that is today. Shrouds, I'll briefly mention research in shrouds are no longer being sold, but they were good. Product choice, so is it volatile or not? We'll very, very briefly touch on that because we don't actually use a lot of volatile products in Western Canada. There's increasing popularity of drift reducing adjuvants. DRT stands for drift reducing technologies. But I actually don't have anything in this presentation on that, but we can certainly cover that in question period if you wish. Situational awareness, excellent opening in the talk by the Alberta regulators just before lunch on what should you watch for. That was great. And then cultural controls, buffer zones, windbreaks. We may touch on that at some point. Okay. And this is a slide from Jason. And Jason says this list has changed very little in the last 15 years because, well, physics. It's very, very true. The fundamental thing that we have to do in spraying is we have to take a relatively small amount of liquid, and we have to distribute it uniformly over a fairly large area. And the example is that we often give is this football field size. That's about an acre, and we use a pop bottle of pesticide, and we have to distribute that uniformly over that football field, and that's a huge challenge. How do we do that? We do it by atomizing the liquid, and we have to atomize it into relatively small droplets for that whole premise to work. And so it's a very fine edge on whether we are too fine or too coarse for that whole application of pesticides to actually work. So as I said, the initial release is intuitive, and I think a lot of us can talk about the effect of droplet size and boom height and wind speed and so on and so forth. We'll show you some data to sort of hammer that home, but I think we all kind of know what we have to do. The subsequent behavior, once the spray leaves the boom and sort of drifts off into the distance, that's much, much less intuitive. And that's why we'll spend a little bit more time on mechanical versus thermal turbulence, sort of surface roughness a little bit, because we want to be able to kind of make a prediction of what we think will happen based on our surroundings. Traditionally, drift looks like this. This is a picture provided to me many years ago by Richard Lucier, who at that time worked for Agricor. And basically, someone sprayed their wheat field here and drifted into this canola field. And the classic thing is that you've got some damage and it dissipates very quickly. In fact, there's a logarithmic decline of drift damage with distance under normal daytime conditions. The spray droplets fall out fairly quickly, and the ones that don't actually go up in the atmosphere. They actually never come back down, at least not in the immediate future, because they're diluted and they become airborne pollution. They may come back down later. For example, work by Bernie Hill in Lethbridge many years ago showed they come down in rainfall. I mean, that's called wet deposition. We know that. And in fact, he found that at the time of dandelion season in and around Lethbridge, they found significant amounts of 2,4-D dicamba and mecoprop, your lawn weed killers, in rainwater that fell in small rainfall amounts in the vicinity. So that was very interesting. Certainly, windbreaks are useful. Here you see the opening in the windbreaks causing more drift damage. We have done some work. I won't present today, but windbreaks are very effective and they don't have to be very dense. In fact, if they're too dense, they act like a brick wall and basically the drift goes up and around and comes back down on the other side. It comes back down some distance downwind, but it does actually come down. And I do have to say, I kind of lament the loss of our windbreaks in Western Canada. You know, they were basically replaced with conservation tillage practices, but they did have a powerful purpose on mitigating wind damage as well, or drift damage as well. And that is essentially being lost with the disappearance of the PFRA and their tree shelter belt farm. This is a picture from Manitoba provided to me by Ron Tone, a consultant there, and this turned out to be inversion drift. So you can see that there's really no pattern to the damage, except that it follows the lowest part of this field in the Red River Valley in Manitoba. And kind of the drift cloud kind of just moved very slowly, probably in the early morning, and probably just kind of went downhill, as it were, and created severe damage to this canola field as a result. So that is inversion drift, very, very damaging. Someone's mentioned that earlier. Just to review the past, I started in this business in 1989, and the first thing we did was study shrouds. Wasn't quite that long ago, but this is the egg shield shroud, popularized in the 80s. This is the flexi-coil shroud. We really only see these now on used sprayers. They're no longer being offered in the market, but they were good. And when we did our testing with them, we found the following. So here we have airborne drift amounts. Here we found wind speed in kilometers per hour, and we conducted about 25 trials and about 4 or 5 for every sprayer. This is a standard sprayer, unshielded. It's an 01 nozzle, so that's an 80-01 tip. So that's a fine tip with a pull type sprayer, 5-gallon tip basically. At 20 kilometer per hour wind speed, we observed about 7% spray drift, 7 to 8% spray drift, and that's high. To be quite honest, it's a high number. By using shrouds either with a 110 or an 80-degree fan, we were able to reduce that by about 50 to 70%. So the shrouds were quite effective. As I said, these days they're really for sale on the side of the road, which is unfortunate because I do believe the pull type sprayer still provides a very, very viable option for our herbicide applications. Shrouds are making a bit of a resurgence. There is a supplier in the US that makes this beautiful yellow shroud for a foldable boom, which is quite an accomplishment. And then, of course, in Australia, we are increasingly seeing these row crop shrouds, and they're basically intended, as is depicted in this lentil crop, to spray non-selective herbicides between the rows. And of course, as you know, they have a ryegrass resistance issue, and they're actually spraying paraquat, gramoxone, as we used to call it, between the rows, and it's safely applied, kills the resistant weeds, and doesn't hurt the lentil. So a very clever way. By the way, Steve Shirtliff with Eric Johnson at the University of Saskatchewan are currently studying this exact method of controlling weeds without a broadcast spray. Low drift nozzles, though, have really done it. I mean, this is a picture we took some time ago. We took this picture, I think, in 96, 97. And so almost 25 years ago now, when the low drift nozzles first appeared. And this is a conventional flat fan tip. This is actually an 8004. We ran it at 40 PSI, and this is just an afternoon at the Ag Canada Research Farm. And this is below it is a Greenleaf turbo drop nozzle. It's the same size nozzle. It's a 11004, and the pressure here is 70 PSI. So we even increased the pressure so we would have the optimum as recommended by the manufacturer, and look at the difference in drift. And you can see this is glyphosate we sprayed on the left side, on the right side here. On the left side of this picture, we had a wind from the left, and you can see the drift damage. And then with the low drift nozzle, we didn't. And these pictures are old and widely distributed, but they really do highlight how powerful just droplet size is. And it is the number. It is the biggest hammer by far. But there's something else that these low drift nozzles do that's very useful. So here, we did a drift trial, and this is a pull type sprayer here we used, and we actually measured the amount of airborne drift on using towers. So the drift would have been released off screen on my left, would have blown maybe 20 kilometers per hour towards these towers and downwind. We capture everything on these towers and measure how much it is. And we said, okay, that's 2.9%. And then we also captured everything on the ground, up to 120 meters downwind, and we only found another 0.5%. So about, 3/4 of the material that left that field actually became airborne and never came back down, except, as I said earlier, maybe in wet deposition or maybe dry deposition later, days, weeks later. We don't know where and how much. So this is just basically atmospheric pollution. But the ratio of what goes up and goes into the atmosphere to what comes down was 5.7x. Okay. Now, if we do the same thing with the air induction tip. So first of all, we reduced our drift by a factor of 4, almost 5. Look at this. This is 3%. This is 0.7%. There's a factor of 4-fold reduction just by using this tip. And the second thing is, we actually didn't reduce the downwind deposition by that much. We halved it. So here's the original nozzle, and 0.43% and 0.21, so half as much. So that's significant, but the biggest decrease was actually in this airborne drift component. So this is a much lower polluting nozzle, even if it isn't necessarily damaging to the downwind crop. Less of it goes into the atmosphere. And I think that's a really good agricultural story. That's another reason to use these nozzles. But the self-propelled revolution that we've experienced over the last same 25 years or so has really created serious problems for us. And the main problem is that it's tough to have a low boom. This is a picture I took while driving. This is near Nakim, Saskatchewan some years ago, and I thought this was excellent. He had wheels for his auto boom. His boom was low. Of course, the field was perfectly flat. And he was, of course, looking nervously at me thinking, if he's going to be featured on the front page of the Globe and Mail or something, but I kindly didn't embarrass him. But my point is, this looks like a low boom, but it's 2.5 feet off the ground. It's very, very difficult with a high clearance sprayer to go 2 feet or less, which is often recommended. So that's a very difficult task. Here's the issue. When we go back to our drift trials and we look again at airborne drift and wind speed here, and this is miles per hour now, I converted that. And I think it might have been for a US audience. If we look at the airborne drift from a conventional nozzle with a pull type sprayer using a medium spray, this is what we had, and it was about 3% at about the 20 kilometer per hour wind speed. If we use an air induction tip, as I said, a 4-fold reduction in drift and airborne drift, less than 1% at that same wind speed. And that's powerful. Now, if we do the same thing with a 30-inch boom height, a fast traveling sprayer, we are talking about using a turbo T-jet nozzle. This is actually a coarse spray, not even a very fine spray. It's a low drift spray, but the drift amount is exactly the same as it would have been for the much finer spray in the previous slide, about 3% at this 12 or so mile per hour wind speed. We did find a reduction in drift with it extremely coarse. It was about 2-fold though. And so even though this nozzle here is extremely coarse, and we did what we could to reduce drift, we just simply couldn't get to that blue line at the bottom, which was the low boom, slow speed sprayer. This increased amount of drift is attributable entirely to the higher boom height and the faster travel speed. Don't know which is more important, but certainly combined, that's the package. And that's a tough one to rebound from. People say, well, I want less drift. I'm going, well, we've done everything we can with the nozzle. The only way you're going to reduce your drift is to slow down and lower your boom. So unfortunately, not an easy answer technology-wise. This is a picture I sometimes show. This is a drone picture I was given by a collaborating farmer. And he phoned me actually while he was doing the spraying because we were finishing a trial, and he said, guess how fast I'm going? And of course he was yanking my chain because he was going 27 miles an hour, he told me. And he had to finish that field. It was a Durham field, Fusarium head blight, time window was tight, and he put the hammer down to get her done. But you can see that the plume behind his sprayer really extends far beyond, and it's really not a recommended practice. He's fortunate the weather was good, but that's about all I can say about that. Remember the buffer zones that we heard about earlier, labeled buffer zones, and the drift reducing technologies really only work for non-volatile products. And I won't belabor this, but the situation in the United States with dicamba, which is volatile, even the low volatile formulations of dicamba still have volatility, was severe. They had record amounts of drift damage, much of it attributed to volatility. There have been lawsuits, there have been all kinds of litigation actions in the US about this. It is based on two things, the highly sensitive nature of soybeans to dicamba, and this leaf cupping that we're seeing here is a characteristic response to dicamba. It extends throughout the season, the growing season. Even new leaves that come out will have the leaf cupping. If you spray too late in soybeans, the seed that germinates the following year will come out of the ground with cupped leaves. So it's a tremendously sensitive response. And secondly, of course, the fact that dicamba remains volatile even with the Ingenia and the XtendiMax formulations that are commonly used there with lower vapor pressure, all right, but still not low enough. So that issue cannot be corrected with anything that we do, because vapor drift, or it's difficult to. I mean, you certainly cannot correct it with a coarser spray or a lower boom, because the vapor loss may occur tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It'll occur overnight when there's inversions, and it will drift off the field during those inversions and create widespread symptomology. What can we do about this? The best strategy really is to always think about vapor loss. It is to try to use non-volatile products if at all possible. And I really do I wish there were better reporting by the manufacturers as whether their product is volatile. It's not a very widely known fact. Most of our herbicides in the groups 1, 2, 5, 9, 10, 14 are not volatile, the most common ones. But group 4s, the 2,4-Ds, MCPAs, mecoprops, dicambas, in their ester formulations are volatile, and some of them even in their amine formulations. So trying to avoid those whenever possible. And if we do spray volatiles, is to avoid spraying them on or before hot weather, which is a problem for the vapor loss. It's related to temperature. Okay. It's better to spray in wind than in the calm conditions. And that is a challenging message to give, but it's absolutely true. I stand by it. If it's calm and we're up at the crack of dawn and we think we're going to have success, we are going to be gambling, because the spray this is smoke, but if it were spray that is emitted, simply does not disperse. And so it can create widespread damage from a highly concentrated spray plume. Remember, we rely on wind and sun to disperse the spray plume, to actually take it into the atmosphere and take it out of the equation. An inversion prevents that from happening. Here's what an inversion is. An inversion, basically, in a nutshell, is the measurement of a temperature profile. Remember this, there's going to be a question on this in about 5 minutes. So normally, the temperature increases with height, okay? And decreases with height. I've already made the mistake. Temperature decreases with height. At lower atmospheric pressures, air tends to expand and cools, and that is why there's snow on mountaintops. Okay. So when we take a parcel of air, when the sun shines, that whole effect is actually exacerbated. In other words, the sun now heats the ground. The ground in turn heats the air nearest to it more, and that air is superheated. Now, it still cools with height, but it cools faster because the effect of the sun diminishes, and eventually we return to that original temperature that it would have had. So there's a faster rate of cooling. We call this super adiabatic, which means that when a parcel of air rises, it expands, as they all do, because of lower atmospheric pressure. As a result, it cools. Now, the question is it less or more dense than the air around it after that step? Remember, it started off warmer because it was warmed by the sun. And so when it cools at a known rate due to atmospheric pressure, it cools a certain amount, but will still be warmer than the air around it. As a result of that, it continues to rise. That's called a thermal. And these thermals go up and down. Actually, they create tremendously powerful mixing of anything that's in the atmosphere. If you make a fire during a sunny day, it's a little breezy. You're not going to be bothered. No one's going to be bothered by its smoke, unlike in the evening or early morning. Now, an inversion is when the opposite temperature profile occurs. So normally, temperature decreases with height, as I said, but under an inversion, which happens at night, the sun is absent and the ground cools. Now, the ground cools the air near the ground, and as a result of that, it is very cold, and it actually, that ground effect is less effective at higher heights. As a result of that, the temperature actually increases with height. So an inversion, the definition of an inversion is that air temperature increases with height. Air temperature increases with height. Write that down. Okay. So if we can measure air temperature at two different heights, we know whether it's inverted or not. It's that simple. Okay. So if a parcel of air goes up and as a result of that expands because of lower pressure and cools because of that expansion being work, it will actually still be denser than the air around it because it started off cooler. Even cooling and expansion. So it's just going to go back down to where it came from. And that's sort of the situation we have with early morning fog. You know, sometimes, you know, you drive home at night and it's dark and you get these sheets of fog that sort of seem to come at you at head level in the car and you almost have to duck to get out of their way. You drive through those, and if you were to return to that same spot a minute later, that ice fog would be exactly where it was before. It just returns to its original position because of that. That's the phenomenon of an inversion. It does not disperse the spray. And this is a daily phenomenon. So we basically, if we say, all right, here's temperature, to the right is increased temperature, here's height, up is higher, we have a decrease in temperature with height and on typical afternoon days, sunny afternoon days. By sunset, the sun disappears and the ground begins to cool. It actually starts to cool before sunset, and the temperature of the air is reduced, and as a result of that, air near the ground is colder than the air above it. And that is an inversion right here. And this inversion just grows. It can grow to hundreds of meters high, actually, over the course of a night. And then in the morning, at sunrise, the first thing that happens is the lower level of air becomes normal again, because the sun heats the soil in turn heats the air, like I said, and then you have decreasing temperature. But then you still have an inversion above that. So you can have, you know, dispersion of the spray in this tiny area, maybe the first 5, 10, 20, 30 meters, and it grows continuously as the day continues, but it's capped. It's capped in here. It cannot escape here. This is called an inversion cap. So you do have to wait a couple of hours after sunrise to get the full benefit of this thermal dispersion that actually occurs, and the whole thing repeats daily. Now, we don't have an inversion every night, but there are mesonets, and North Dakota has a really good one, for example, and they're closest to us. But they have about 70 or so stations, and they report inversions at each and every one. And they have said about 70% of their summer nights are inverted. 70%. So you can basically assume there's going to be an inversion in the morning. And the only thing that sort of reduces the severity of the inversion are things like wind. So if there's a low pressure system coming in, it's probably going to be windy, and that actually then creates turbulence. You want that. Cloud cover sort of, you know, prevents the strong heating and cooling of the ground. That is one of the reasons for inversions, that kind of a thing. So that's what you got to watch for. We basically are saying, you know, in the evening, the inversion starts to build. This is validated by data from Missouri and North Dakota and other places that have studied this at the university level now. Inversions start to build much before sunset. So early evening, it builds, and it's an absolute no-go overnight. In the early morning, the inversion just simply fades, and you've got to basically, by your urge to go out there and have another cup of coffee and just wait a little time for that inversion to burn off. I don't have a picture of it, but there is a thermometer you can buy from InnoQuest. It's available with Nozzle Ninja and Stettler. It's a thermometer that basically you wave at a high level, sort of above your head, about 3 meters high, and you also and then it records the temperature and says, "Okay, I'm done." And then you also wave it at ground level, and it until it has a temperature, it beeps and says, "I'm done," and then it tells you whether the temperature over your head is warmer or colder than the air below, and it'll tell you whether there's an inversion. So that's very cool. In an inversion, air flows like water. It basically will follow topography. So that's why we had that picture of sort of like the water run. It flows downhill. It flows in valleys, and you can often see some of the damage resulting from just very, very slow, gradual movement of a suspended spray cloud with that air mass. Here's a video. I hope you can see this all right. This was taken by a fellow named Richard Anderson, works for BASF in Ontario. And he put smoke bombs on a sprayer boom early in the morning. Sun's already up, but guess what? Inversion. So this mimics this cloud of smoke mimics the behavior of tiny droplets that might not settle out fast, and they just linger. Now they don't have a lot of dose in them, but they linger for a long time. And that's also a portion of this drift damage equation. They basically will expose the plants underneath them to the pesticide for a very long time. And that results in serious damage. I'll stop the video here, but what we did see later on was that the spray cloud actually moved over the same area twice. It kind of moved to the left, and then half hour later came back and moved back to the right, and basically lingered. Like I've never seen such a profoundly useful video for inversions. So very serious issue.
Tom,
All right.
quick question for you.
Yes.
There's a question in the chat. It says, what's the typical height of an inversion/inversion cap?
So we measure inversions only up to 3 to 5 meters, basically the height of a tower. But in the course of a day, an inversion will grow several hundred meters above ground level in the surface boundary layer. Somewhere between 300 and 500 meters is possible. And if you ever fly again, if that ever happens again, once I flew out of a larger city and I noticed that the air was hazy as I was near the ground and we're rising. It was a clear day. And then as we broke through this 300 to 500 meter altitude level, all of a sudden it became clear. And then I knew that we had just crossed the inversion cap, and nothing below that was allowed to leave. So great question, though.
There's another one, actually.
Okay.
Do inversions occur more frequently in a rural landscape than an urban landscape? And do urban structures help decrease frequency, or is it strictly based on temperature?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but let's explore it. The inversion phenomenon is related to the presence of the sun. And so cities and urban and rural landscapes will be the same there, but it's related to the ability of the soil or the ground to remain warm. So, for example, let's have black asphalt. Once the sun sets, it doesn't immediately become cold. It cools off much slower than soil would, and so it might prolong the ability to spray without having an inversion. But I would suspect that inevitably, even the concrete and other things that are thermal sinks would eventually cool off. We do know, for example, that in near walls in the fall when we have maybe a frost, the frost tends not to be as severe near walls because they actually radiate temperature and prevent frost from happening nearby. But on the whole, I'd say I would suspect inversions are just as serious in cities. In Saskatoon, we are allowed to have backyard fires burning our yard waste or wood. And when you do that in the evening, I mean, it just doesn't disperse. So that's an inversion right there. If that is it, I'm not sure, Jamie, do you see this slide poll question? I have one on inversions.
There's actually one more question that's just popped up before we move on to the poll question. Would evaporative cooling from plant transpiration impact the formation of inversion caps?
Yes, great observation. This is a very cool thing that happens, but it usually happens only in hot climes and in very dense canopies. And the example that I'm going to give you is one that was given to me by Dennis Gardesser, who's a specialist in Arkansas, and he said that you can have evapotranspirative cooling at the top of a canopy that actually will lower the air temperature, thereby creating an inversion cap right there at ground level in the middle of a hot summer day, so that your spray actually can't easily penetrate. The small droplets actually have a very hard time settling through that inversion cap because there's no turbulence that helps them go down. So they may just, the finest drop components may just linger and may not go in there. Yeah, very cool observation. I don't know how serious an issue that is for long distance drift, but it certainly is an issue for their ability to, when they spray by plane, for example, to get the fine droplets into the canopy.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So, Jamie, if there's no other questions, maybe the poll, and then maybe you can just read off some of the responses when we get them.
You betcha. So the question is, inversions are best described by A, calm conditions any time of day, B, cooling of air temperatures with height, or C, warming of air temperature with height. And responses have started to come in, and they're climbing, slowly climbing. Okay, good. So we're seeing, for the most part, 86% are saying C, the warming of air temperature with height.
Excellent. Well done, students. It's a trick. I put a trick in there, and that was calm, but I gave you a hint at any time of day. Calm conditions are, in fact, associated with inversions, but they don't cause them. And you can have calm days when the sun is shining, and the temperature will decrease with height. It is not inverted. If you make a fire under those conditions, the smoke will just rise. It will just rise out of sight. And even if it doesn't get displaced sideways by the calm conditions. So if you have a calm afternoon, don't worry about it. I mean, I can't guarantee it. There are sometimes local conditions that are unique, but you will probably not have an inversion. It's just that it's rarely calm in the afternoon is all. That's great. Okay, guys, I'm going to move on. We've got another 20 or so minutes on this topic, and then we will carry on. I want to just finish off the second half of this talk with basically an insight that I can give you about how we do research in drift and what other things we've learned. So drift trials across the world are conducted on fields. We certainly have also got wind tunnels. We don't have such a wind tunnel in Western Canada, but we typically use commercial scale equipment. We had to sort of fold this Patriot's booms in because we had a limit to the width that we could do. But we typically do the following. We'll make a single pass with a single, the width here was 18 meters, and we will collect spray underneath the spray boom, and we'll also collect spray downwind to 120 meters. We've gone to 160. We've gone to 400. We used to go much less, but now we have better sensitivity of our analytical technique. So we use a fluorescent dye in the tank, and the dye is sensed very accurately down to parts per trillion. So we actually can see just about anything even further away. We will also measure airborne drift at a 5-meter distance. And we also measure deposition upwind to make sure there's anything weird going on, and we do photolysis up here. We make a single spray pass, we wait a few minutes, and then we go out and we collect these samplers. Now the samplers, international standards are Petri plates, 15-centimeter Petri plates, so the spray will ultimately settle in those, even though they don't look aerodynamic. We also use rotor rods. These are U-shaped brass rods that spin at 2,400 RPM, and they collect about 120 liters per minute of air, basically. And then any particle that's impinging we then wash off. These rotor rods, by the way, are used for pollen monitoring. So they coat them with Vaseline and then they collect pollen and identify the species of pollen and then give people, ragweed pollen alerts and those kinds of things. That's a tower. We also sometimes put string up like this, and then we'll collect the string and cut it into different widths. So here's the 4-meter high tower with a rotor rod at each meter. This is Brian Caldwell. I mentioned him earlier. He's my business partner. He does all this work. I just do collect the glory of it. And he very innovative man, developing some of these techniques. Field looks like this. We just make repeated passes, and we always just take the wind from the side, and if it deviates more than 25 degrees from perfectly perpendicular, we move the whole array around and move it somewhere. Usually takes 5 to 10 people to do it. So we have to run out and collect and lay out and make sure everything's done properly. So it's fairly labor intensive. Over the course of a summer, the crop canopy is desiccated. We sprayed it so it doesn't grow out of sight, but then the conditions change a little bit. So lots of walking in rubber boots. We collect data from commercial nozzles using commercial systems. And we then go into the lab and we use ethanol to wash each and every Petri plate by hand. And that we can process a few hundred a day that way. We then collect them, it's just a little bit of wet chemistry, collect them in little vials, and we do fluorimetry on those. And the fluorimeter, as I said, uses a little sipper cell, so it injects a small tube into these vials, draws maybe 10 microliters out, and maybe more than that. The sipper cell is only 10 microliters, draws maybe 10 milliliters out, and then gives us a reading, and that's how we do it. And it's just data analysis. Weather, terribly important. So we use sonic anemometry. This is sonic anemometer right here. Other kinds of things, and the results are compelling. So when we measure over the course of a large trial, maybe this is probably about 25 trials, 20 to 25 trials, all kinds of wind conditions, all kinds of boom heights and spray qualities. This is an average of what we found. So of the 100% we spray on the swath, only 80% comes back down directly under the swath. It's 20% is not where it belongs. Now, admittedly, the 15, the largest part of what's missing, is very, very close by. So we don't call this drift. We actually call this swath displacement. It's a side wind. Maybe it's inaccurate driving. Who knows? But there's really that now we have 97% caught within the first 2 meters of the spray swath. So that's very good. Now there's another 3%. Of those 3%, here's the 3%. 1% falls down at the 5-meter distance, and the other 2%, most of it goes into the air. And I showed you some of those results earlier. There was just a slightly more detailed version of this. The majority of the spray, though, goes into the atmosphere on a sunny summer windy day, and a very small minority. It goes down on the ground. This is the part that causes the problem, though. This is drift damage. Okay, we don't know what happens to that. This is drift damage. It's a tiny amount, so it accumulates. So that's the picture I showed over there. So drift results are really hard to agree on. So, for example, I was part of a study in 2016 where we, 3 research groups, Bayer Crop Science in Germany, Julius Kühn Institute also in Germany, and us in Canada. And there was a few others that followed suit in the following years. We went to Poland, went to France, and went to Italy for additional studies. And we did exactly the same thing. We shared the protocol. We used the same nozzles. We used the similar sprayers we could with the same boom height, same travel speed. And we said, okay, what are we getting for drift? And look at this is log. This is a log scale, which means these are 10-fold difference. The differences between our 3 institutes were a factor of 10. Wow. So, Europe versus Canada, sure. Maybe summer versus fall, sure. But I would have not expected it to be that different. Even within one research institute, this is the Julius Kühn Institute. They're highly regarded. They're professional. At the closest distance to the boom, they had a 10-fold difference in the amount of drift that they detected in a single pass. It's just a variability. And of course, that diminished, but it was still highly variable. And some people always ask me this question. They say, how far do droplets drift? And the answer is not one that'll satisfy you. The answer is there is not a safe distance, as long as it's relatively intermediate. And that's because drift damage is not a function of how far a droplet drifts. It's a function of how sensitive the downwind ecosystem or crop is to what's in the tank. Okay, because it will get there. And here's some work we did more than 10 years ago. This is deposit. This is distance. We went to 400 meters. This is a conventional medium spray. It's a straight line, but look at 400 meters, we're still seeing significant amounts. This is background amounts. Okay, we did various different ways of measuring background. This is all above background. So it is absolutely detectable at very high, that's a quarter mile, very high distances. So it's really just a question of what's in the tank. If it's dicamba and you get soybeans downwind, it's very difficult to avoid damage if you're spraying in the wind. If it's a different herbicide, it'll be likely a little bit easier to conceal. But if someone were to do a sampling of water, ground, or plant material at that distance, it's very likely that they would be able to detect the chemical in that material. Okay, I already said airborne drift is so these measurements are variable. This is now our own study of variability, and this is just one spray quality, one boom height, and these are 5 trials that we did over 5 different days. And again, almost a factor of 10 difference in the amount of deposit all the way along the line. We're trying to compare medium to extremely coarse sprays here, and you can see the open triangles are extremely coarse, and of course that line is significantly lower than the medium spray. But notice that there is overlap, and the confidence limits touch each other at the extreme ends. So it's very difficult for us to definitively say this will drift less, because under some conditions it may not. So unfortunately, not the easiest thing. Remember that the cost of drift is paid at its destination. That means, this is what I'm trying to say, when we measure how much drift deposits under the swath, it actually isn't that affected by wind speed. It's more or less a straight line. You can see higher winds, maybe slight reduction here at the extreme, but more or less a horizontal line. But the downwind deposition is where the damage is. So the price is paid by damaged crop, right? Here's 2000 again. This is not a significant reduction in deposit. We lose somewhere between 10 and 20%, but doesn't really affect efficacy, to be quite honest. Very coarse sprays work. So we're trying to find ways of reducing drift, and coarse sprays are the biggest hammer. In grassy targets, we have found in our research it's absolutely acceptable to coarse sprays. So the average air induction tip, and we'll talk about tips, in the herbicide resistance talk, unfortunately, in a little while, but we will get there. They will work. If you go beyond that, because it's a grassy target, difficult to wet, has a harder time, so I don't recommend that. The broadleaf targets, easier to wet, much more easy target for a large drop to be retained on. In all of our research, we found very coarse sprays absolutely still work. In fact, if you look at the dicamba label, I know I'm giving a lot of dicamba examples, but it's the one that we've researched the most as a community, scientific community. They're saying extremely coarse and ultra coarse droplets even still work. Admittedly, they have to be at the full 10 gallons, and in the US now the label says 15 gallons. So remember that dicamba also has soil activities that mitigates it somewhat, but we typically don't want to go extremely coarse, and particularly with our tank mixes that contain contact products, and obviously grassy tank mixes as well. The drift from multiple spray passes is additive, and what that means is if we were to have a set of samplers right here and we just kept going upwind and kept doing the amount of spray we capture would absolutely add up, and it's worse at the furthest distances. So we make a pass here and measure everything, and then we take some plates away, and then we just keep on doing. Every time we made a pass, we would collect a new set of plates and lay them out again. And basically, here's what happened. Here's a single pass, and you're familiar with this graph now. This is deposit, amount of applied, logarithmic scale. And here's downwind distance, logarithmic scale. So it diminishes with distance in a log-log fashion. And this is a single pass. When we went to all passes and added 10 samplers together, we found this. And so we, particularly at this furthest distance, we had a doubling of the deposit. So, and we also modeled it, and were able to come with a very similar result. So that was very important. So the buffer zones, if we were to only measure a single pass, we'd say, hey, there's a buffer zone of 100 meters that's appropriate for this particular risk assessment. And that's how the PMRA does it for ground sprayers, by the way. But for aerial, they do multiple pass. And so, in fact, this is a highly sensitive situation here. For multiple passes with sensitive chemistry, the buffer zone would have to increase quite a bit. So that is not yet reflected in all risk assessments, but it may well be in the future. I already talked about non-volatiles. We've already talked about that. So here's some data that I want to share with you. This is actually going into some more depth about the wind. This is airborne drift. This red line is airborne drift. The gray line is deposited drift. Okay, so this is what leaves the field, and this is what comes back down in your neighbor's field. A slight trend with increased deposit at higher wind speeds, but not that strong. We looked at all the other data as well. Here's airborne drift with a low drift nozzle. Here's deposited drift with a low drift nozzle. No significance to wind speed. Here's airborne drift with a high boom coarse spray, and here it is the deposited drift with a high boom coarse spray. No relationship to wind speed. Here it is with a low drift nozzle, and here it is again, no relationship to drift to wind speed. So this is why I said at the very beginning, it is better to spray in the wind than to spray under calm and possibly inverted early morning, late night conditions, overnight conditions, in fact. I'm going to give you one last example before we finish off with some other opportunities. And that is, if you're in a situation where you have a tank of product, or maybe your field is far away from your base, and you've gone a long way to logistically to be there, and the winds come up, and you feel no longer comfortable finishing that field. What do you do? Okay. And the answer is, if you're prepared for that situation, there's actually a lot of things you can do and safely finish spraying that field. For example, on your last tank, you could mix a higher water volume, and that would force you to drive slower. Then you could lower your boom or maybe your pressure and increase the spray coarseness. It might not work quite as well as you want, but you will only lose a small amount of efficacy. It probably won't even be noticeable. So those are the kinds of opportunities that are available to you if the winds come up. On the other hand, if you have an inversion and it's early morning or late night, there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. Once you release the spray into the environment, you don't know where it's going to go, and you can't put that thing back in the can. So that's a much more serious situation, much more frustrating, and has a much stronger negative consequences potentially. So we've only got about, I'm looking at my clock here, we've got about 8 minutes left, and I actually would rather that I'm just going to make a last point. And then I think if there's any questions about drift, we'll finish off the first hour with those questions. So I want to talk about this issue of restrictions and sort of how we as an industry deal with it. We are going to be increasingly restricted. For example, again, the dicamba example, restricted by wind speed, by temperature, and by time of day. That's the label, okay? So that's very serious. And then this is Adam. He's in North Dakota. He went to various weather stations and said, if we abide by these restrictions, these are the number of hours we have per month to spray. And it's not a good picture. Okay. And so the issue really is about time accountancy and realizing that this red and this yellow piece of that pie needs to be reduced so we can get more spraying time. This is engine hours, so I'm assuming that sprayer's running because it's a spray day. And I'm seeing more than half of the time lost due to other activities. And it is the efficient use of this time that will increase the blue piece of that pie and give us the opportunity to finish spraying even under severe restrictions. And that's where I'd like to leave it. What I'm going to do is escape from this and give you back, I think, let me just see here. I'm going to stop sharing. Jamie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
And we have our first question in the chat.
Okay, great.
It says, do you have data on drift using Lucky Tech products or Astound, and how much they help combat inversion as well?
Yeah, we do have some data. Lucky Tech products, for those who don't know, are a Loveland product. It's found in Valid. It's most notably found in LI 700. This is an oily formulation that has been shown to reduce drift. And under contract with Loveland, we did do some testing of it. And what we found was that the reduction in driftable fines was about 50%, very significant. So this is on sort of in terms of magnitude about the same as you would with a low drift nozzle, maybe not quite as much. The additional advantage of this kind of technology is that it doesn't actually increase the fine, the coarse drop component, which is a big problem for low drift nozzles. There's a lot of big drops that come into play here. With Lesitech, and also, by the way, with Interlock, the droplet size doesn't actually increase. It just eliminates the small droplets. Now, the question was, is that any better than nozzles? It's not your first course of defense. We still think hardware is your first thing. You can be more powerful than these adjuvants with a proper nozzle selection. You can do additional things. You can change things on the go if you want to change pressure and move back and forth a little bit with droplet size, depending on where you are. And secondly, the question was, can they mitigate inversion? The answer is no, unfortunately not. No low drift nozzle can reduce the impact of an inversion, because we always produce enough fines, just enough to create a cloud that can condense, that can actually concentrate and actually stay and linger. And it doesn't matter whether that's a 1% of your spray or 5% of your spray. Whatever underneath is going to get damaged.
Fred, you have your hand up. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, hi Tom.
Hi, Fred.
I've gone back to a time of cassette tapes and pull type sprayers, and I have a question. So I spray between 5 and 8 miles an hour,
Okay.
between 12 and 30 gallons per acre. It's a high clearance, 120 feet, 35 to 55 psi. Should I have the boom tips angled forward a little or back a little?
Great question. The angle of the spray for most of our herbicide work doesn't matter. Okay, because and the reason is that the herbicide targets, the weeds, don't present a very complicated target. The spray will get there, whether you point forward, backward, or down. It's going to be about the same. The only time that we've ever felt a strong need to angle the nozzles was when we go with that sprayer into a high clearance, into a fusarium head blight, where the wheat head is here and we have to hit it from the side in order for it to get targeted. And that's where the forward angle is beneficial. So my typical answer to your question is, if you're doing fusarium with your sprayer, and I'm not sure, did you say it was a high clearance or not? I mean, it's pull type, right?
Yeah, it's a high clearance.
It's high clearance. If you're going, if you can be reasonably sure that your boom is low enough, like 20 to 25 inches in fusarium, then absolutely use an angled spray. But for your herbicide work, you don't have to worry about it. If you want to stick with your single nozzles, they will be every bit as good as a double nozzle. Here's what double nozzles do. They can make your spray finer because they're using one orifice, and there's, of course, the two are smaller. But that's not always true. Sometimes a different manufacturer will make a low drift twin nozzle that is actually coarser than the single nozzle it replaced. So you have to be very careful. We will talk about nozzles very specifically. I'm going to go through all the nozzles at the very end. Okay, not on my last talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's another question here in the chat from John. Not sure if he missed a comment, but how much of an effect does creating dust have on spray efficiency?
Yeah, it depends on the mode of action. Dust is a problem for some herbicides, and glyphosate is the best example. Glyphosate and Reglone, or if we still use it, Paraquat, is another version of that same mode of action, is sensitive to dust. So they're sensitive to dust not just from the wheel tracks, but also from turbid water. So they will just cling on to soil, basically, whether they're in a droplet or in solution. So those are important. And how do you reduce the impact of dust? It's a travel speed question. It's maybe a tillage question. It's an agronomic question. And by the way, just to finish off that answer, different people have studied whether different formulations help. No. Whether different water volumes help. No. So it is a thing that you have to sort of correct at its root. In other words, try not to generate dust if you can help it on those days.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions that I see through the chat.